without me spilling the water. You're doing really good. So, one of the things I hate more than anything else is reading my own stuff aloud. My voice shakes and it makes me really nervous. I could read anything from anybody else that you would like, but reading my own is a little bit of a challenge. But I am going to read a couple of really short ones. But as a writer, nothing I like to talk about more than writing. So I want to talk about a little bit about the craft of writing and some of the things that go on in the background of stories. Specifically, I'm going to talk about short stories because it's a completely different sort of storytelling than when you're writing a novel or you're writing even a longer short story, which would be, like 5 or 6 of my columns end to end. Really short writing requires a kind of a different set of tools, which are, in my opinion, easier than writing novels, but then there are people who like to write long stuff. Long stuff requires that you have things like plots and character arcs and you plan. None of those are my strong point. So short stories, the kind of writing that I do, like in a newspaper column, is usually you're just taking one event, one concept, and telling a story about it. And so you're really trying to tell a story in as few words as possible, but not really. Because if you were going to tell it in as few words as possible, that's like reporting. So if I was going to report something, it's going to be very straightforward, chronological, just the facts. So I would say something like, well, I tend to daydream a lot, and sometimes I forget things, and last week during the cold snap, I was so distracted I actually forgot to put gas in my car. Okay, so it gets the point across, you get the information, but not real entertaining. So what you do as a columnist, and especially a humor writer, is you take that concept and you try to figure out a way to tell that story in a more entertaining manner. So this is a column that I wrote sometime about 1.5 years ago. So some of you might recognize it, some of you might not. But it's called What I Was Thinking. Every time I walk into my kitchen, there's one ant on the counter. Just one, meandering across the little square of formica between the stove and the sink. Never on any other part of the countertop, never more than one. Every time I see that lone ant, I can't help but wonder. Well, first I squish it, then I wonder, why only one ant? Why not 23? Ants are not by nature solitary creatures. They're supposed to travel in armies. So who is this single ant? A scout sent ahead to determine the lay of the land? Or a countertop, as the case may be? If I don't squish that solitary ant, will he whip out a tiny little bugle and summon the charge of thousands? Maybe it's some kind of hazing ritual. Down there under my stove, there could be an entire ant college, complete with ant fraternities and minuscule ant kegs, and at some point some idiot has to say, I bet I could make it across the counter. That would also explain why they never travel in straight lines. Of course, I don't spend my entire day in the kitchen. My husband would argue that I have been known to let days pass without showing my face there. So it's possible the ants file across the countertop one by one all day long, and it's only the occasional unlucky ant who happens to get caught. Squish. Oh shoot, we should have warned Bob that she always passes through here at 6 in the morning and 5:30 in the afternoon. Oh well, hey George, your turn. I suppose you're wondering if there's a point to all this. There is. Last weekend my husband got into my Jeep, turned it on, and pitched a fit. It's 5 degrees outside, there's blowing and drifting snow, the roads are crap, and you're driving around on empty. What are you thinking? Now you know. So basically you're taking, an entire 5 paragraphs to make the point that yes, I tend to be distracted and daydream a lot. And this is what the people who talking about when they talk about writing. This is what they call indirection. And Hemingway talked about indirection a lot. He called it a three-bank shot. He said, never go directly at everything if you can go at it from an angle, and preferably several angles, and come up from the rear. So in comedy especially, the bank shots are where you get the good laughs, because you want to kind of come around and catch people by surprise. So you're also, in a lot of stories, telling a story that is one thing on the surface, but something else entirely underneath, like that one, which is basically a whole story just to illustrate the fact that I'm really not here a lot of the time. So in another way of putting it, you're illustrating your point versus just telling someone what you're thinking. So when it comes to keeping stories short, there are things that we as writers can do to take shortcuts. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those. There was a guy, when we lived in Oregon, who wrote for a Southern Idaho newspaper and wrote some of the funniest columns I have ever read. Unfortunately, he decided he would rather train horses for the Kentucky Derby than write for $10 a column. I don't know. So he actually trains horses now for a place called Treetop Farms, and had a horse in the Derby last year named Rousing Sermon. But he wrote these great columns, and there is one line, one of the places in short story writing, and even in novel writing, that we take shortcuts is in description. So what you're doing when you write description, some writers write these long, flowing, poetic, beautiful descriptions, and that's wonderful if you're that kind of writer, and if you're the kind of reader who, unlike me, doesn't just skip over that stuff to get to what really happened. But what you really look for when you're writing description is that one little detail that can paint a whole picture. So one of the lines from one of his columns that has always stuck with me went something like this. I don't have the column, so I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it said, "All of us regulars laid our bets, even the waitress with the dirty ankles." So if you were to read that, what would you figure is on the menu at that cafe? Probably not filet mignon. So immediately, as soon as you read that, describe what's parked in the parking lot.
A pickup.
Yep. Probably got a gun rack. You know, if there's cars, they're probably a big old four-door Chevrolet. They probably serve French fries and greasy burgers, and they have, yep, and the tables are a little rickety, and when you sit down, they sort of wobble. And you can pretty much picture who the clientele are. And you get all of that from one sentence, and basically just from one thing, the waitress with the dirty ankles. Because immediately you get a whole picture of the kind of restaurant where someone like that would work. And those are the little nuggets of description that you try to find, because they're like the magic beans. You throw something like that out there, and the reader takes it and they grow a whole picture from it. So feels. When we're doing description, and actually it's the bonus question is, would you want to use the restroom there? But there's more than one reason for doing that. First off, yeah, you're saving space, and you're giving the reader an easier way to get description. But the second thing is you're actually making an interactive experience. So you're not laying it all out in front of them and saying, this is exactly how it looks, this is exactly how it smells, this is exactly how it feels. You're giving them one little detail, and you're letting them fill in the rest from their own experience. So now they're actually involved, because it's their restaurant, it's their memory of a place that they've been. So you really engage their imagination, and they also personalize the story. It's now their own story because they're imagining a place that they've been versus you telling them about a place they've never been. Obviously, if you're writing about the Death Star, you're going to have to give a little more detail. But for those of us who write about places here on Earth, that's one of the shortcuts. If you can even find that, though, you will. There are things about even fantasy and sci-fi and those kinds of stories. They still have to give you something you can relate to. If it's so far out there that you can't imagine yourself even a little bit in that situation, most people won't be engaged by the story. So even when people are writing really far out stuff, they're still putting things in there that you personally, most readers, can find something in there that they relate to. Whether it's a relationship between the characters, whether it's the fact that the coffee in the cafeteria is lousy, whether you're on Babylon 5 or at the hospital in Cutbank, whatever. There are those little things that make it an experience that everyone can relate to. So, another, and it's sort of the same thing, but really what writers use, and we tend to think of as a negative, is we really use stereotypes. So we tend to think, when you say stereotype, it has a negative connotation for most people. Most people hear stereotype and they think, oh, bad. It's racist, it's bigotry, it's that kind of thing. But actually, a stereotype, for most people, is a shortcut to understanding something. So when I tell you something like the little line about the waitress with the dirty ankles, there's a stereotypical diner that comes into your head. And that is how we process all these billions and millions of facts that come into our brains every day. We relate them to other things that we know, and we can therefore understand them more easily by categorizing. We can keep track of things better. It's like a filing system in our brain. So we can use stereotypes that way as writers, again, because I might have a minor character that shows up in one scene at a convenience store, and I want to make him colorful, and I want to make that an interesting scene, but I don't want to waste a paragraph of description on a character you're never going to see again. So I might say something like, Bobby Ray had gained some padding since his all-state linebacker days, but his skull was still thicker than his neck. So immediately, where do you think Bobby Ray lives? Probably not in New York City, although there are rednecks everywhere, I've learned. Probably doesn't drive a Mercedes. He's probably got that pickup truck, or better, an El Camino. And what kind of dog? Not a Chihuahua. He's probably got some big old bulldog or something in it. So, and that's another trick that we use, which is just the character's name alone we can use as a descriptor. Because people who name their child Bobby Ray are not quite the same as people who name their child Edward or something stylish. So, anyway, this is, people a lot of times will ask, what books on writing should I read? If you want to write humor, this is my go-to book. And I don't know how many of you have ever read Patrick McManus. He is from Spokane now, or that area, I believe, but he grew up like in the mountains of Idaho, and they were poor, really poor. And so a lot of his stories, he's the guy who writes the stories in the back of Field and Stream magazine. So people tend to think, well, he's a hunting writer or a fishing writer, but actually a lot of his best stories are just about being a kid and all the stuff they did to entertain themselves before video games came along. And The Deer on the Bicycle is one of his most popular stories, but it's also the title of the book that he did on writing and general and specifically writing short and writing humor. I really like this book because it also includes what he considered his greatest hits, and then after each story he does a little commentary about, you know, why he wrote it, how he wrote it, what he was trying to accomplish with it. And so for me it's just a really great kind of peek behind the scenes, and then just the fact that he is a really funny man. And of course I didn't bookmark this because that would have required me.
Is he still alive?
Oh yeah, yeah, he is. I don't think he's in our storytelling budget, unfortunately. But this is kind of an example of the sort of thing why this is such a fun book for a writer. It says, if you are a funny writer, short-term humor is probably your best bet for breaking into a magazine. No editor in his right mind will turn down a great piece of humor. The tough part is finding an editor in his right mind. So, like I said, if this is, I would highly recommend also into any of his other books. I think my two favorites are probably How I Got This Way, which is about the things that happened to him as a little kid, including falling out of a school bus onto his head, that made him how he is today. And then there's another one called The Night the Buried Goomba that is a really good one. So, but I've never actually read anything of his that wasn't really good. So I believe the library has a few of them here if you want to check it out. So I brought another, like I said, another short one. And this is just something I wrote one day because it happened. So, and people will ask me, you know, where do you come up with your stories? Well, just being alive, having a child, having horses and dogs, and being sort of clumsy helps a lot. You know, I mean, stuff happens. Like, we went skating last weekend. So, we're down on the pond skating, no big deal. Well, we have this dog who's like a couple years old. She's still young enough that she goes everywhere 100 miles an hour. And she goes with you anywhere, and she immediately takes off out of the car and starts doing big, huge laps, chasing birds, going as fast as she can. So she gets out of the car, she takes off over the hump of the reservoir we were skating on. I paid last complete track for her. I get out there on my skates, I'm going down the middle of the pond, and all of a sudden this streak of black comes, and she came flying up the way that she always does, and she always stops and then jumps. She couldn't stop. Yeah, it's pretty much human bowling pin. So, you know, and that's the kind of thing that you can't really write a newspaper column with that, but someday, somewhere, it's going to come out. It's just that little nugget that someday I'll work it into some story somewhere. The other good one is, and this is the kind of thing that happens, and most people just kind of go on and don't think about it. We were in Great Falls at the other medical clinic that we are managing for the time being, and one of the girls said, "Do you have a cat?" And I'm looking, doing that. So I go, "Oh, I have a dog." Why? She goes, "Well, you have scratches like a cat scratches." Yeah, no, I zipped my neck into my sweatshirt. So it helps to be that kind of person if you're going to write humor. So this one is from just this spring, actually, and or last spring in April, and it's called The Talk. So last night I was sitting there reading, minding my own business, when my child came along and stuffed a very stiff, very dead mouse under my nose and said, "Mommy, why is there blood in his butt?" Oh. May I pause just for a moment so you can all pat me on the back for not screaming? At this point, the conversation paused for the amount of time it takes to snatch a dead mouse out of your child's hand, march outside, and fling it far, far into the bushes behind the house. Then I ordered the kid into the bathroom to wash the mouse germs off his hands with soap. And he said, "Why do mice have germs?" And I said, "Because they crawl around in dark, dirty places." And he said, "Why do they go there?" And I said, "Because they like it." And he said, "But why do they like it?" And I said, "Hurry up and wash your hands so you can have some popcorn." So, but of course this is my child, so he is not to be distracted, and as soon as his hands were washed and I persuaded him that no, he should not go outside with his magnifying glass and find the dead mouse and look at his germs, he immediately returned to where we had started. But Mommy, why did the mouse have blood in his butt? Because he's dead. But why is he dead? Because he got smashed in the mousetrap. But if he's dead, how is he going to get the blood out of his butt? He can't. He's dead. How can he get undead? He can't. Once you're dead, you stay that way? Long pause. And around we went again. So yes, dear husband, who tossed the mouse in the bushes to begin with, I took care of the talk about death. Go ahead and assume conception is all yours.